What if I told you something sitting quietly in your home right now could be affecting how your space feels, and you don't even realize it? Not in a way people usually think, but in a way you actually experience. Because some plants don't just decorate a room, they change it. The light, the air, the feeling when you walk in. And over time, that difference becomes noticeable. Stay with me, because today we're looking at 15 plants that can bring negative energy into your home. And this is where it gets interesting. Plant number 2 is one of the most common indoor plants, but in certain spaces, it can make a room feel darker and more closed without you realizing why. Plant number 5 looks clean and minimal, but it's often linked to a colder, less welcoming environment when placed in the wrong spot. And plant number 11 grows beautifully at first, but over time, it can completely change the balance of a room if left unchecked. So before you ignore what's already in your space, take a closer look, because sometimes it's not what you add to your home, it's what you don't notice. If you like discovering things most people overlook, subscribe and stay with me. Plant 1. Cactus, the one that changes the feeling of a space. Cactus is one of the most common plants you'll see in modern homes. It looks simple, clean, low maintenance. That's exactly why people like it. You place it on a desk, near a window, maybe on a shelf, and forget about it. It doesn't need much. But that's also where something subtle starts to happen. Because cactus has a very sharp visual presence. The structure is rigid, pointed, almost defensive in the way it looks. And while that might not seem important at first, it actually affects how a space feels over time. Rooms are influenced by shapes more than people realize. Soft, rounded plants tend to make a space feel relaxed, open, comfortable. But cactus does the opposite. It creates tension. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, psychological way. Especially in smaller rooms, or places where you spend long periods of time, that sharp, static structure can make the environment feel less inviting. There's also placement. When cactus is kept near entry points, workspaces, or resting areas, it subtly shifts the atmosphere from soft to slightly guarded. And most people never notice it. They just feel like something is off without knowing why. That's what makes it interesting. Not because it's harmful, but because it changes the tone of your space without saying anything at all. Plant 2. Bonsai Tree, the one that feels controlled. Bonsai trees look beautiful. There's no question about that. Carefully shaped, balanced, artistic, almost like a living sculpture. People keep them because they represent patience, control, and detail. They feel intentional. But that same control is exactly what makes them feel different. Because a bonsai tree is not growing naturally. It's being restricted, trimmed, directed, limited in how it expands. And while that might not sound like a problem, it creates a very specific kind of visual energy in a space. It feels contained. In some environments, especially small rooms or areas where you want openness, this can have the opposite effect. Instead of feeling relaxed, the space can start to feel slightly constrained, like everything is being held in place, not flowing. And over time, that feeling becomes noticeable. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle one. People often describe it as a space that looks nice, but doesn't feel as comfortable as it should, and they don't know why. That's what makes bonsai interesting. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of what it represents visually. Control, limitation, restriction. And depending on where you place it, that feeling can quietly influence the entire room. Plant 3. Snake plant, the one that feels heavy in the wrong space. Snake plants are everywhere. You'll see it in homes, offices, corners, hallways, almost any indoor space. People like it because it's easy to maintain and looks clean. Tall, upright leaves, strong lines, very structured. At first, it feels like a perfect plant, but that structure is exactly what changes the feeling of a room. Because the snake plant doesn't spread outward, it grows straight up, rigid, sharp, and vertical. And when you place too many of them, or put them in tight areas, something subtle happens. The space starts to feel closed in, less relaxed, less open. Not because the plant is bad, but because of how it interacts with the environment. In smaller rooms, especially bedrooms or workspaces, those strong vertical lines can create a sense of pressure, like the space isn't flowing naturally. There's also placement. When snake plants are kept in dark corners or areas with low light, they can make that part of the room feel even heavier, almost like the space is absorbing light instead of reflecting it. And most people don't connect that feeling to the plant. They just feel like the room isn't as comfortable as it should be. That's what makes it interesting. It looks clean. It looks modern. But depending on where it's placed, it can quietly change how your space feels. Plant 4. Tamarind Tree. Indoor/close to home. The one linked to old beliefs. This one is different. Not because of how it looks, but because of how long it's been talked about. In many cultures, the tamarind tree has been associated with heavy, still environments, especially when it grows very close to living spaces. It's large, dense, and creates deep shade that blocks light almost completely. And that's where the feeling comes from. Because spaces without light don't feel the same. They feel quiet, but not always comfortable. When a tree like this is too close to a home, especially near windows or entry areas, it can make the surroundings feel darker and more enclosed. Airflow changes, light reduces, movement slows, and over time, that creates a certain atmosphere. People don't always explain it logically. They just say the place feels heavy. And that's how these beliefs started. Not from something supernatural, but from how the environment actually changes. Because when you remove light and openness from a space, you change how people experience it. And tamarind, more than most trees, does that very strongly. Plant 5. Cotton plant. The one that feels unnatural indoors. Cotton plants are not very common in homes, but when they are, they stand out. Soft, white clusters, almost artificial looking, like something decorative rather than natural. At first, they look calm, even peaceful, but the feeling they create is different. Because cotton doesn't grow like typical indoor plants. It's seasonal, temporary. It represents a cycle that ends quickly. And when placed indoors, especially as a decorative plant, it can give a subtle impression of dryness or stillness in a space. Not growth, not movement, just pause. In some environments, especially where you want energy, freshness, or liveliness, this creates the opposite effect. The room feels less dynamic, less alive. And visually, the texture plays a role too. Soft but static, light but unmoving. And over time, that changes how the space is experienced. People don't say, it's because of the plant. They just feel like the room lacks something. That's what makes cotton plant interesting. It doesn't take over a space, but it changes the way that space feels, quietly and over time. Plant 6. Weeping fig, Ficus benjamina, the one that changes a room without warning. At first, the weeping fig looks like the perfect indoor tree. Soft, hanging leaves, elegant shape, something that makes a space feel complete. Many people bring it into their homes, thinking it will add calmness and balance. And in the beginning, it does. But then something starts to happen. This plant is extremely sensitive to its environment. Small changes, light, temperature, placement, can cause it to react. Leaves begin to drop. The structure becomes uneven. The plant that once looked full and balanced starts to feel unstable. And this is where the atmosphere changes. Because visually, the plant no longer feels calm. It feels unpredictable. A plant that sheds constantly, changes shape, or looks inconsistent can create a subtle sense of disorder in a room. Not something obvious, but something you feel over time. Especially in spaces where you want stability, like living rooms or work areas. This constant change can make the environment feel less settled. And most people don't realize it's coming from the plant. They just feel like something in the room isn't right anymore. That's what makes it interesting. Not because it's harmful, but because it reacts so easily that it changes the feeling of the space with it. Plant 7. Eucalyptus, the one that feels fresh, but overwhelming. Eucalyptus is known for one thing, its scent. Clean, sharp, refreshing. That's why people bring it into their homes. It feels like it improves the air, adds freshness, and makes the space feel lighter. But that same quality can become too much. Because eucalyptus doesn't stay subtle. In enclosed spaces, especially smaller rooms, its scent can become overpowering. Instead of feeling fresh, it starts to dominate the environment. And when that happens, the space no longer feels balanced. It feels intense, too sharp, too present. Over time, this can create a sense of discomfort, not because something is wrong, but because the environment becomes overwhelming. There's also the visual aspect. Long, hanging branches, often placed in tight areas, can create a slightly cluttered or uneven look if not arranged carefully. And together, scent and structure, they shift the tone of the room. People don't always say, "This plant is the reason." They just feel like the space is too strong, too heavy in one direction. That's what makes eucalyptus different. It starts as something refreshing, but in the wrong space, it can quietly take over the feeling of the entire room. Plant 8. Rubber plant. The one that absorbs light instead of reflecting it. The rubber plant looks bold, large, dark, glossy leaves that immediately stand out in any room. It feels strong, modern, and almost luxurious. That's why people place it in corners, near walls, or as a centerpiece. At first, it looks perfect. But then something subtle begins to happen. Because rubber plants doesn't reflect light the way softer plants do. It absorbs it. The deep green, almost heavy-looking leaves can make certain areas of a room feel darker, especially if the plant is placed in a spot that already lacks strong lighting. And over time, that changes the atmosphere. Corners feel heavier. The room feels slightly dimmer. The space loses a bit of openness. It's not dramatic, but it's noticeable, especially in rooms where you want brightness, energy, or movement. There's also the visual weight of the plant. Large leaves, thick structure. It doesn't feel light or airy. It feels grounded, dense. And when that's not balanced with lighter elements, it can shift the entire feeling of the space. That's what makes rubber plant interesting. It doesn't do anything obvious, but slowly, quietly, it changes how the room feels. Plant 9. Oleander. The one that looks beautiful, but feels unsafe. Oleander is one of those plants that immediately catches your attention. Bright flowers, full structure. It looks like something you'd proudly place near your home, maybe even indoors for decoration. At first glance, it feels alive, vibrant, almost perfect. But there's something about it that changes how a space feels. Because oleander is known for something most people don't fully think about. It's highly toxic. Now, even if you're not interacting with it directly, that awareness alone can shift how a space is experienced. When people know something in their environment isn't safe, even subtly, it creates a layer of discomfort. Not fear, but caution. And that feeling matters. In homes, especially where relaxation is important, anything that introduces a sense of unease, even quietly, can affect the overall atmosphere. There's also the visual contrast. Soft, beautiful flowers paired with something known to be harmful creates a kind of tension. The mind doesn't fully relax around it. It looks welcoming, but feels uncertain. And over time, that contradiction becomes noticeable. People don't always say, "It's because of this plant," but they might feel less at ease in that space. That's what makes oleander different. Not because of how it looks, but because of what it represents. Something that appears safe, but isn't. Plant 10. Dieffenbachia, dumb cane, the one that feels restrictive. Dieffenbachia is a very common indoor plant. Large leaves, striking patterns, easy to maintain. It's often used to fill empty corners and add a sense of life to a room. It looks structured, bold, and intentional. But there's something about it that can feel limiting. Part of that comes from its nature. This plant is also toxic if handled incorrectly, especially around pets or small children. And just like with oleander, that underlying awareness changes how people interact with the space. But beyond that, there's a visual factor. Dieffenbachia has very dense, compact growth. It doesn't spread lightly or create movement in a room. Instead, it forms a strong, contained presence. And in smaller spaces, or areas meant for relaxation, that can create a feeling of restriction. Less openness, less flow, almost like the space is holding itself in place. Over time, that subtle feeling can make a room feel less comfortable, not because anything is obviously wrong, but because the environment feels slightly closed. That's what makes it interesting. It looks beautiful. It fills space. But depending on where it's placed, it can quietly change how free that space feels. Plant 11. Ivy. Indoor English ivy. The one that spreads too much. Ivy is one of the most common decorative plants. You'll see it hanging from shelves, trailing down walls, wrapping around small structures. It looks soft, natural, even calming. That's why people use it, to create a relaxed, organic feel. But ivy doesn't stay controlled. It grows, and keeps growing. And this is where the shift happens. Because instead of adding to a space, it begins to take over it. Long vines start extending further than expected. They cover surfaces, move into areas you didn't plan for, and slowly create a sense of clutter if not constantly maintained. And that changes the feeling of the room. What once felt natural starts to feel messy, uncontrolled. And over time, that lack of control becomes noticeable, especially in spaces where you want clarity and calm, like bedrooms or work areas. Too much growth, too much spread, can make the environment feel less organized, less peaceful. And most people don't connect it to the plant. They just feel like space is harder to manage, less clean, less balanced. That's what makes ivy different. It doesn't stay where you put it, and if you don't manage it carefully, it changes the entire feel of your space. Plant 12. Mint. Overgrown indoors. The one that takes over quietly. Mint feels harmless. Fresh smell, soft leaves, something people often keep in kitchens or near windows. It gives a clean, natural feeling, like it belongs in a healthy, calm space. And at first, it does. But mint doesn't stay controlled. It grows fast, much faster than most people expect. And when it's kept indoors without proper boundaries, it starts to spread into its space, taking over the container, pushing outward, becoming dense and crowded. And this is where the feeling changes. Because instead of something light and refreshing, it becomes overwhelming. Too much growth in a small space creates pressure. The plant no longer feels balanced. It feels like it's trying to escape its environment. And that affects how the room feels. Not open, not calm, but slightly crowded. People don't notice it immediately. They just feel like the space isn't as relaxed as it used to be. That's what makes mint different. It starts as something fresh, but if left unchecked, it slowly takes control of the space around it. Plant 13. Aloe vera. Overused placement. The one that becomes too much. Aloe vera is known for being beneficial. Simple, clean, useful. People place it everywhere. Bedrooms, kitchens, desks. It's seen as a safe plant that improves space. But even something positive can become too much. Because aloe has a very specific structure. Thick, pointed leaves that spread outward in a sharp, repetitive pattern. One plant feels balanced. But multiple aloe plants in the same space? That's where the shift happens. The room starts to feel rigid, too structured, almost like everything is repeating the same shape over and over again. And visually, that reduces comfort. Instead of a natural flow, the space becomes controlled and slightly harsh. There's also the placement factor. When aloe is placed in resting areas, like near beds or relaxation corners, those sharp outward shapes can subtly affect how calm the space feels. Not dramatically, but enough to notice over time. That's what makes it interesting. It's not about the plant being bad, it's about how much of it and where it's placed. Because even something good can change the atmosphere when it's overused. Plant 14. Fern. Dense indoor ferns. The one that makes a space feel closed. Ferns are often chosen for one reason. They look natural. Soft, detailed leaves that create a full, green appearance. They're used to bring life into a room, to make it feel more organic and alive. And in the right setting, they work. But when ferns become too dense, the effect changes. Because ferns don't create space. They fill it. Layer upon layer of leaves, overlapping, creating a thick visual texture that can feel heavy in enclosed areas. And in smaller rooms, or spaces with limited light, that density can reduce the sense of openness. The room starts to feel more closed, less breathable, less clear. It's not about the plant itself, it's about how much of it exists in one place. Too much density reduces flow, and people feel that, not consciously, but emotionally. That's what makes ferns different. They bring life into a space, but without balance, they can also take away the feeling of openness. Plant 15. Monstera, overgrown indoor, the one that takes over the space. Monstera is one of the most popular indoor plants right now. Big leaves, unique cuts, modern look. You'll see it everywhere, from bedrooms to offices to social media setups. At first glance, it feels perfect, stylish, fresh, alive. And in the right balance, it is. But Monstera doesn't stay small. It grows. And when it grows indoors without proper control, it starts to dominate the space around it. Large leaves begin to spread outward, taking up visual space. Instead of complementing the room, the plant becomes the main focus, whether you want it to or not. And this is where the shift happens, because a space that feels balanced starts to feel controlled by one element. Too much of one thing creates imbalance, and visually, Monstera is heavy. Wide leaves, deep green tones, strong presence. If it's placed in a smaller room or near resting areas, that heaviness can reduce the sense of openness. The space feels tighter, less breathable. Not because something is wrong, but because the balance is off. There's also maintenance. When Monstera becomes too large or untrimmed, it starts to look chaotic instead of clean. And that subtle visual clutter changes how the room feels over time. People don't say, "It's the plant." They just feel like the space is less calm, less organized, less comfortable. That's what makes Monstera different. It starts as something beautiful, but without balance, it quietly takes over the space. Take a moment and look at your space. Not just what's there, but how it feels. Because sometimes, it's not the obvious things that affect your environment. It's the quiet ones. The ones you stop noticing. And the truth is, this isn't the only thing in your home that can change how a space feels without you realizing it. There are small details, right in front of you, that most people never question. So here's what I want you to do. Look around your home today, and notice just one thing differently. And if something in this video stood out to you, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to understand your environment on a deeper level, subscribe and stay with me. Because once you start paying attention, you begin to see things most people miss.